Okay, hello, welcome along. It's Dara Brophy here. I'm the news editor at the journal.ie. We are going to wait just a minute or two so people can join the call. But just while we're here, I might as well just tell you who's joining us. We have Shona Murray, the Europe correspondent with Euronews, and she is joining us from not so sunny Brussels. We have Christina Finn, who is joining us from a secret location elsewhere in Dublin, where it does look pretty sunny. And we have Mirish O'Carroll, who is in a different corner of the journal's newsroom. How are you all doing? Thanks for coming along.
Christina's probably not in Dublin though, is she? She's in Costa del Sol.
Oh, I wish,
I'm just
I wish.
pretending.
God, here's hoping one day this summer, after all the elections are done.
Yeah.
It certainly looks like that, all right. So yeah, you were saying, Shona, the weather's not great in Brussels today for.
No, it's a bit dark now, and it's actually all weekend. It was stunning, really gorgeous weather, 25, 27 degrees the past few days, but today and yesterday, lashing rain. But Brussels does rain a lot. Now we get good summers, but it rains as much as Dublin.
Right. Well, it's certainly rained a lot here, but it's the sun has come out the last couple of days, so hopefully it holds up for the campaign so we can get out and hit the streets. I'm getting a note here from Nikki that we're ready to formally go. So not that it makes much difference, but I'll actually do the introduction now. We can start talking about the weather. So I'll introduce you all again in a second. So anyway, we've 720 seats to fill in the next couple of weeks. Not us personally, but Europe does. There's 27 member states and there's 3 time zones across which to do it. Coverage of the EU elections is set to ramp up significantly across various outlets in the next couple of weeks. And given the scale of the operation, not to mention the size of the individual constituencies, the elections are a huge challenge for any outlet to cover. So here to discuss some of those challenges and some of the novel ways that broadcasters, newspapers and online outlets like the Journal.ie have come up with to overcome those challenges. We have, once again, Shona Murray, the Europe correspondent at Euronews, who's joining us from Brussels. We've Christina Finn, political editor with the Journal, and Mirish O'Carroll, reporter with the Journal, who at the moment is spending most of his waking moments concentrating on the European elections. So good few people have tuned in to join us this morning. And if you have a question for any of the guys here, just drop them into the chat box and we'll get to them as we go or possibly at the end. So we'll just get straight into it. So first of all, Shona, thanks for joining us. So just on these elections, the European Parliament President Robert Metsola said last month that voters are aware that the stakes are high at the ballot box and that voting is even more important given the current geopolitical context. So why are these elections being regarded to be so high stakes by the EU power brokers?
And it's Roberta Metsola. She's a woman president of the European Parliament. But yeah, well, it is because we've seen the polls. We've seen the polls that potentially the far right will do well. But also we've seen in the member states, similarly, the far right looking good in polls on national elections and also coming into power in countries like Italy, in Hungary, in Slovakia. And that is a real concern because regardless of your opinions about people, individuals, the far right tends to have views which are about reducing workers' rights, not supporting the Green Deal, the environment, being anti-migrant, or also having a much more sort of xenophobic tone when it comes to migration and migrants, which is obviously creates huge difficulties. It creates huge division. It creates hate. They tend to also, in some cases, although not all, take a view that Ukraine is not some country that the EU should support, which is problematic because Ukraine is suffering a genocidal invasion from Russia, and that's a very strong consensus. But if you have more countries or more MEPs coming in with the view that Russia's invasion was the fault of NATO or the United States, then you leave an important Ukrainian ally to essentially fail and potentially die, which means there'll be a lot more immigration, obviously, across Europe. But moreover, it means that a country can get away with invading a European country on the European continent. So that is why it's a real concern. I mean, even things like the Workers' Platform Directive from the EU, which gives workers' rights to people who work for Uber and, the sort of the deliverers and so on. I mean, they're really important bits of progressive legislation that are voted on by MEPs. But if you have lots of far right, those bits of legislation won't get voted in, and then you see a change completely in European policy. So there is a lot at stake.
And Christina, looking at the main political parties here, are those concerns shared? Are they concerned about the rise of the far right here too?
Yeah, I definitely think that is concern among the main political parties. I think among them, there's sort of a sense of the unknown when it comes to these European elections. Very quickly, they've had to, you know, either they've had to deal with the issue of migration, which, a couple of years ago, I remember speaking to one senior minister, and they were saying, immigration is going to be the next main battleground for politics. And this was previous to the Ukraine war, previous to what we've seen in Israel and Palestine. And, very quickly, I think politicians have had to deal with issues that perhaps they're not used to. And we're coming up to, the election date. And as Shona was mentioning there, who gets into your, has a really big impact on not just, I suppose, the direction of Europe, the priorities of Europe, but also, I suppose, legislation. 80% or so bits of legislation that Ireland has to transpose does come from the European Union. So, there's a lot to play for, and I think the main political parties understand that.
And Shona, when it comes to your day job, we want to talk about how news outlets are covering the European elections this time around. So you're based in Brussels. I don't know if you're going to be based in Brussels throughout the rest of the campaign, but what are the challenges, given the distances and given the number of candidates? How do you make sure you keep track of all the stories that are happening across Europe, and that you give equal time to different candidates on air?
Well, we can't do it like that, because obviously we obviously cover every European story. So, I mean, obviously the attempted assassination of Fico yesterday was a prime story. So obviously our coverage for the European Union was dropped, or for the elections was dropped slightly. But we have bureaus in most EU member states, all the big ones, Berlin, Paris, Madrid. We also have bureaus in Athens and Budapest, and regional bureaus, and bureaus in Warsaw. So we have teams that deal with those local issues for Euronews and for the Euronewses in Spain and so on. And then sometimes we would incorporate some of those into our main coverage, but we have journalists on the ground in those countries. So that's how we sort of get the wider coverage. And then here in Brussels, we cover the election by covering the so-called Spitzenkandidat, or the lead candidates. These are the candidates that will evolve as a result of the European Parliament elections, which will take the top jobs in the European Commission, the President of the European Council, and so on. So to give you an example, Ursula von der Leyen, she is the EPP candidate. The EPP is one of the 7 groups which Fine Gael belong to. So if Fine Gael were to do well, along with the rest of the EPP across Europe, then Ursula von der Leyen has a strong chance to become re-elected as President of the European Commission. So we sort of deal with the I suppose the executive element here in Brussels.
And I suppose just on that, there's a big debate next week. I think it's one of the first big debates with the candidates for the presidency of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, facing off with various other candidates in Brussels in a debate hosted by the EBU. Is that likely to be a big deal? Is there likely to be a lot of coverage around that? And are there other set-piece debates like that that are happening in the next couple of weeks?
Yes, so far there's 3 debates. One, Politico did one 2 weeks ago in Maastricht, and then there is 2 more here in Brussels, a Bruegel debate and then the EBU one. And they will be important because it gives everyone an opportunity to take an idea as to what the candidates want if they were to lead the Commission, if Ursula von der Leyen was to lead the Commission again. And interestingly, in the last political debate, the first one, the political one, she said that she would, if she had to, do a deal with the ECR, the European Conservative and Reformists. That is a far-right group. Not all of the members are far-right, but it tends to be, which obviously shocked people, because the consequence is that you have a Commission president who is willing to move to the far right, which means that the Commission, which is the executive, would be influenced very strongly by anti-migration, disregard for social elements of the European Union, and the environment. I mean, remember when she came to power, her biggest, strongest success was the Green Deal. And already she started to water that down. And will she water it down even more? Will she have to if the ECR is going to do a deal with her? So these are the things that people really need to take into account when they're voting for their MEPs, because the MEPs you vote for, they are tied to a group, and that group can then become senior in the executive piece of the European Union. So that's why they are very important. What I would say, though, is I went to the political debate in the Politico one in Maastricht, and they didn't have a huge amount of coverage. And I thought that was quite disappointing, because overall, people need to really take these elections seriously.
Okay, well, we have the EBU one in our calendar for next Thursday. So we'll certainly be covering it on the Journal. And Christina, when it comes to covering the EU elections in Ireland, I think we've got the first of the bigger debates this evening on the Tonight Show on Virgin Media. But still, they're not. It's not possible to have every candidate in the field. It's the Dublin constituency they're doing first of all. So, what are the challenges that broadcasters face and that outlets like ourselves face in terms of covering these huge constituencies now with far more candidates than we had in 2019 or 14?
Yeah, well, it's a very different beast, I think, in covering the European elections than even the local or the general elections. As you mentioned, we have that debate on Virgin Media this evening, and there's always controversy around these televised debates because not everybody gets invited along, and it's just part of the game that people get annoyed when certain parties get they're not invited and they feel they're not getting their fair shot, at getting their points across. So that is one aspect of it. Secondly, it's just the sheer scale of it. So even if you're looking at Ireland South, you're talking about 1 million people in that constituency. You're talking about 10 counties from, as north as Bray down to Cork. I was chatting to one European election candidate during the week, and I was saying, "Oh, how are you getting on? How is the reception?" And they were like, "Well, I'm not really hitting the doorsteps because I can't hit everybody's doorsteps. I'm not, it's hard to gauge, I suppose, how they're getting on and the mood and how successful they might be given the sheer scale of it." So I think perhaps in a more modern world, we've seen a lot of things play out more on social media. They've been, that's why the televised debates perhaps are so important when it comes to European elections. Even when you see certain candidates getting traction online, for the issues that they pinpoint, that's very targeted in terms of making sure that they are getting name recognition, face recognition with voters, because there's such an array of people on that ballot paper come June 7th, and it's trying to engage people, and I suppose that's the challenge that people face, and for us, I suppose, in terms of the media covering it, that is one of the crux of it is there are the sheer amount of candidates, making sure that you pick interesting issues, you pick interesting candidates that you speak to, but also making sure that it's not just the focus of the main political parties. They have the money behind them, they have the push and the clout, and there's a lot of other candidates that have thrown their hat in the ring, and I think anybody who decides to put their name on the ballot, deserves to be commended. It's a big step for people to take, to put yourself out there, to say that you want to make a change. And I think the media in that way, should be, cognizant of that it's not just the Fine Gael, the Fianna Fáil. There are lots of other people that are trying to get their points across, and I suppose that's the balancing act that the media has to face.
It's interesting how the campaign has changed in the last decade or so. I won't name the candidate because I'd feel like I'd have to name them all in a certain constituency. But there's one candidate who I've seen who is looks like they're out on the doorsteps, and they're throwing shade at other candidates for not being on the doorsteps and pointing out where they are while they're out hitting the streets. So we can see the candidates who are adept at social media kind of breaking through like that, or it might just be my algorithm. So just to bring Mirish in here. So Mirish, the Journal has been carrying out some polling in conjunction with Ireland Thinks, looking at what voters in Ireland have been telling us about the issues that matter to them. So could you just bring us through what the biggest topics are that are of concern to voters? This poll, I think, was published last month.
Yeah, so these answers were collected in April. 50% of voters said that immigration was of top concern on their list. Following that was 17% for the conflict in Gaza and the various conflicts going on in the Middle East, or the risk of further conflict there. 13% was said that they were concerned about the war in Ukraine. 11% for climate change, and then 8% for economics, and 1% for tech regulation. If you think about like kind of the last 5 years, we've had Brexit, COVID, the invasion of Ukraine, cost of living crises, and then obviously conflicts in the Middle East. These kind of issues are very similar. You can see kind of how they relate to each other, and it shows that voters are kind of engaged and are aware of what matters for the EU and what matters for them as well. And then, like Christina was saying, our role as kind of media is choosing interesting issues and angles and candidates to talk to. And what these polls help us do is kind of select those news lines to kind of prioritize to see what is most interesting to readers and most impactful to readers too.
And Shona, I suppose we talked a bit about the rise of the far right and immigration already, but when you look at that polling, the Irish polling, so immigration at 50%, Israel, Gaza 17%, Ukraine below that. Say in Eastern European countries, is Ukraine likely to be a much more important issue across there?
Oh, it's top of the agenda. I mean, these are countries that suffered brutal repression from under the Soviet Union in living memory. They like the Baltics, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia. You speak to any MEP or any person from there, they remember their family members, the teachers, nurses, doctors, whoever being sent off to Siberia, to the horrors of the Soviet Union are not far away. And so they very much are concerned about the war in Ukraine seeping into their own countries. They're glad that they had an opportunity to join NATO, that they have the cover and the collective security of NATO. They feel that that's really important to them. And they worry that the EU or the other member states aren't actually doing enough to support Ukraine, because we've seen in Ukraine over the past 6 months losing parts of Kharkiv, Avdiivka, the lack of military support coming from Europe and the United States, which has meant that they've had to withdraw west. So Ukraine is, on the back foot. And even with the $40 billion or $60 billion, $40 billion from the United States, I mean, military experts will say that they'll only barely be able to recover some of the ground that they lost. So the idea that Europe and the West is behind Ukraine and wants it to be victorious, it doesn't actually bear out in practice. And these countries are very worried about their futures.
And staying in that region, you mentioned it briefly earlier, but the shooting yesterday of Robert Fico, the Slovakian Prime Minister, the news this morning is that he's no longer in a life-threatening condition in hospital, which is good news. But what sort of impact is that likely to have on the campaign in Slovakia and the wider region as well, I imagine?
Well, it's interesting. I actually, just before that happened, I had a long conversation with a Slovakian diplomat about Fico. Fico won the election. He got in October last year 23% of the vote, which is fairly good. But one of the reasons why he got back in as prime minister, it's his third term as prime minister, is because of the really terrible governments beforehand, the internecine feuding and so on. But he's actually seen as a sort of Kremlin-linked or Putin-esque or Orban-esque type character. He attacks the media. So he is trying to have a stranglehold on independent media. He's tried to introduce this law, similar to the one in Georgia, that the Georgian people are protesting in earnest over the past few days, where you target independent media, journalists, opposition politicians, NGOs, and so on. So it'll be interesting to see if that has affected, or that has been in effect, and that the media have actually been hampered, and whether or not the shooting of him yesterday will garner some sympathy. It's hard to know. People did protest when he became prime minister, because one of his objectives was to end military support for Ukraine. And he comes out with this sort of conspiracy theories around the United States and NATO being the fault of Russia having to go into Ukraine. And he's anti-LGBT. He kind of spouts a lot of the stuff that you heard from Viktor Orban as well.
And Christina, I suppose like these issues are all related, but when it comes to the campaign at home and the headlines in the last couple of days, we've seen the government parties at least pivot to respond to the immigration issue in the last couple of weeks. Do you think other parties will make a similar move now? And how do you think the issue is going to influence the campaign from here on? You were writing about this just yesterday in terms of the cuts to supports for Ukrainians.
Yeah, I think there's definitely, as I said, been quite a big shift in government policy pretty much since Simon Harris became Taoiseach. He was speaking about all of government approach, Team Ireland, coming together. He was speaking about that primarily when it came to tent encampments, which he said shouldn't be allowed to pop up in and around the city centre. So we have seen, I think, from my perspective, I think that when we're speaking about Ukrainians particularly, and the social welfare cuts that we've seen announced this week, the government was very much patting itself on the back, I suppose, over the last number of years in terms of the support and help that it was giving Ukrainian refugees. And from my perspective, it very much feels like that green jersey that was put on and much talked about is very quietly being taken off and put back into the wardrobe. And very much so because politicians, no matter what they say, they look at polls and they look at them very carefully. And as you pointed out, immigration is one of the biggest issues facing people, of concern at the doorstep. So they're not blind to that. And that's why we're seeing, I suppose, that pivot from them and perhaps a very hard positioning, I think, one that we might not have expected even just a few months ago. And if you look at the other parties, when you're talking about perhaps the likes of Sinn Féin, they've faced a lot of criticism, I suppose, for sort of testing the wind, not coming out on certain issues when it came to migration, to very much try and get a sense, I suppose, of where things might land in terms of the public. And it's interesting, I suppose, to point out, even when we're talking about those social welfare target cuts that should impact about 27,000 Ukrainian refugees that are currently in states serviced accommodation. That was an idea that Mary Lou McDonald actually put forward a good few months ago in terms of tapering off supports for Ukrainian refugees. So it's interesting to see, I suppose, you're not seeing that opposition clash with the government, very much so because they seem to be on the same page when it comes to these issues. And there's no doubt about it, I think it's going to be one of the main talking points in the run-up to these European elections. And as I mentioned before, it's something that this government and Irish politicians have had to, grasp very quickly because, as Sean, I've discussed this with her before, in other European countries, migration has been a talking point for many, many years. And it's very much just a new one, it feels like, for Ireland.
I'm going to bring a reader question in here because it's on topic. So I'll throw this out to Shona and or Christina, and then Miriam shall bring you in to talk about the candidate database. So this is from Joan O'Connell. And if anyone else has a question for any of the panel here, just throw it in the chat box. So Joan says, going back decades, news organizations seem ill-equipped to challenge far-right politicians who incorporate far-right speaking points. Fact-checking initiatives are absolutely necessary, but have they come too late, particularly with the growth of online platforms? And Joan adds, is fact-checking itself even moot, given the infiltration by the far right of mainstream politics and institutions, as we've seen and as Shona has outlined? So you were mentioned there, Shona, so if you want to...
Yeah, I mean, I think that polling from Eurus is really quite remarkable because one of the reasons why we have so much far-right propaganda and hate is because of tech companies not being regulated. And I mean, you look at what Twitter is now, it's nothing incomparable to what it was maybe 10, 15 years ago, which was a really interesting place where you, as a journalist, you found fantastic, really worthwhile interactions. And I'm not saying it was always polite and nice, but now when you tweet anything to do with anything, I mean, I tweeted yesterday just a news piece about the new coalition in the Netherlands, and just barrage of abuse about, nonsense that I was trying to assume a point that I was making, which I wasn't, but. And but yet in that polling, only 1% of people feel that tech regulation is important. But 50% feel that immigration is important. In actual fact, a lot of the reason why immigration is important is because of the algorithms and what's been spewed on the social media. I mean, I see it myself, old videos of maybe a person with brown skin doing something, and then the video coming from a far right account in Ireland saying this is Moore Street now, and it's not even bloody Ireland, what I mean? And so people don't see that it's the tech regulation is actually should be almost on par with climate change and global warming. I'm not saying that immigration shouldn't be tackled, but in a fair and strong way. But the fact that it's overtaking societies is just really extreme, and it comes a lot from the far right and from politicians like Viktor Orban, who seek to dehumanize immigrants. I mean, for a long time he called Syrians Muslim invaders. These are people suffering from bombs from Bashar al-Assad or from Vladimir Putin in Aleppo. Didn't criticize Putin for bombing these people's homes, destroying their families, torturing them, just targeting the people themselves. So I actually think it's really worrying, that polling that we saw there.
And Christina, would you have changed the way you tweet about things, the way you cover things on social media in the last couple of years because of those sort of reactions that Shona outlined?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because even if you are just covering, a quote that a certain politician has said, people automatically assume that you're pushing that point, or that it's your point of view. And you're actually like, I'm actually just covering leaders' questions. I'm actually just reporting what Micheál Martin is saying or what Mary Lou McDonald is saying. I'm not putting myself into that tweet, but people will automatically just jump on things. So I think there's no doubt about that. Journalists have taken a step back from social media, have reluctantly engaged in any sort of debate when it comes to that, and have very much just used it as a platform to put forward their work, put it out there, and leave it there for people to judge, rather than get into, I suppose, the back and forths that perhaps, as Shona said, would have been interesting and perhaps informative, and people would have disagreed politely or not so politely a few years ago, but perhaps would have been categorized as a healthy debate. That very much seems to be lacking, I think, at this point now, when it comes to social media and journalism.
But also the far right themselves attack journalists as a way of delegitimizing the work that we do. And you see it in actually Fico does it. I mean, particularly he doesn't even speak to the so-called mainstream media. Orban is the same. They decide that they only choose certain journalists. For example, they had a meeting here with their think tank a few weeks ago. It was Suella Braverman from the UK, European Research Group, another person who uses disparaging language about migrants. Was Orban. There was a few others, Farage, typical bunch of people who have often been accused of disinformation, and they wouldn't allow certain media organizations cover it. Now that is saying something about the way they will deal with journalists, and that also puts journalists in danger, because you delegitimizing journalists like that means that they are discredited, means that they are they can come under attack on social media, that they're seen as liars, the lying media. It started off with Trump, and now it's becoming normalized. And you have it normalized where in Brussels, politicians, prime minister from a European member state can decide what European journalists can cover an event that they've decided to create here in Brussels. I mean, that's really far gone. And the more and more we accept it, the more and more it'll happen. And then where do people get their news from? From the far right, News Express on Twitter, or or people like us who actually have to work within a particular framework of rules, of regulations, of decency, of truth, of fact checking, of libel laws.
That actually brings us very nicely to talking about some of the work that the Journal is doing over the next couple of weeks, as this campaign continues. So Mirish has been looking after the candidate database for the Journal. So Mirish, can you tell us what that is? You've been sending questions to as many candidates as possible. I know sometimes it's been hard to even track them down and get phone numbers and email addresses in the last couple of weeks. So what questions have we been asking them, and what's the candidate database all about?
Yeah, so the candidate database is essentially like a hub for readers and anyone else to look up and compare, contrast what their candidates believe in. You can also pivot it for each of your constituencies, so Dublin South and Midlands Northwest. And at this stage, yeah, there was some difficulty contacting a good few of the kind of independent candidates or minority party candidates, but at this stage, more than 50% of them have responded, so that's a good thing. But we've asked them about their priorities, what groups they'll be affiliated to in the European Parliament, and then why should people vote for them in their opinion. So you can compare and contrast those answers. As Shona was detailing earlier on, the groups is a very interesting point because already we've seen a few parties who aren't necessarily detailing exactly what group they'll be a part of. Some of them are specifically saying that I'm going to wait and see how the parliament looks and the makeup of the parliament before I make my decision, which, I mean, we kind of complement that with other content as well to kind of explain why that's important and why we've asked these questions through explainers and various different things.
And looking at the field this year compared to 2019, I don't know if you've like the exact figures at your fingertips, but it's a much wider field and there's a lot more fringe candidates this time around, isn't there?
Yeah, yeah. And we were talking about this yesterday. It was more kind of like we were talking about kind of how COVID skepticism has kind of influenced a lot of people to be in these echo chambers and believe that like they have a large following online and that they might be able to secure a seat in the European Parliament because of that. There was 59 candidates in 2019. Now there's 74, so that's quite a jump. And yeah, there's, as I said, there's a lot of independents, minority parties, but interestingly, they're polling high at the minute. But if you also look kind of deeply into those figures, there's lots of TDs going this time compared to last time. And that's from every party: Labour, Fianna Fáil, Sinn Féin, and then also independent TDs as well. So you know, it's a different playing field. It's a much more interesting playing field. But I mean, the polling itself doesn't necessarily reflect there'll be a huge shift to the right or to the left or to kind of any radical side as what is polled elsewhere in Europe. Kind of more people are saying, for example, yesterday polling in Munster reflected that there will still be a seat for Fianna Fáil, there will still be a seat for Fine Gael. That's not, you know, that's not out of the norm. But it is interesting. It's going to be kind of waiting to see if those figures are actually correct or accurate.
And we're going to jump ahead to previewing what's going to happen on the actual count weekend in a second. But just to stay with you for a second, Mirish, to get slightly meta, and if we can promote another journal event from within this current event, our next live event is happening next week in Galway. What's going on there?
Yeah, we're talking about the climate, the impact of the EU and the climate, and we have a number of experts, including our own Lauren Boland, who writes a lot of Temperature Check, for example, our newsletter, yeah, so I mean, the events so far have kind of focused around enlargement and various kind of foreign affairs of the EU in Dublin. Then last week we had the cultural diversity and sort of kind of social cohesion within the EU, and then this week it's climate. And I mean, we talk about the issues that are impacting voters. You know, for next week, climate is 11% of people say that that's impacting it. So being able to kind of delve into these topics a little bit more in detail with experts who can talk to them with a lot of value, that can kind of highlight those minority issues which aren't getting enough traction because, as we detailed previously in this conversation, kind of immigration and other conflicts globally are kind of overpowering the situation at the minute. And
we'll tweet. That's hard to say. We'll tweet details of that event after this webinar wraps. So just looking ahead to the actual weekend itself. Christina, voting day in Ireland is for the local elections and the European elections, and the Limerick mayoral race is Friday, the 7th of June. What happens then? When are we likely to have MEP seats filled?
Yeah, so we have the ballots obviously or the votes taking place there on June 7th, throughout the day. Busy day for everybody in terms of, your local candidates, if you're down in Limerick, the mayoral, and also your election candidates that you'll be voting for. And then really, when the counting starts the following day, that's, I suppose, when all of us journalists will be fast typing it and trying to get exit polls and see where the lay of the land is. And given, I suppose, the sheer scale of, constituencies in the European elections, it can take some time for, official results to come out. So I think last time around it was very late in the day on Saturday evening when we sort of could say with any certainty what we were facing, but officially those candidates and the seats being filled weren't actually announced until some days late, the next day on the Sunday, and even into the following week. So there's a lot of moving parts, I think, particularly with the European count. And just if people are interested in still registering to vote, I think the deadline for you to get in touch with your local authority is the 20th of May, so not far off now. So if people are tuning in and they still haven't checked the register to make sure that they are indeed on it, get in touch with the local authority to get your application in by the 20th of May, so your voice can be heard and that you can have your say.
And Shona, finally, I suppose it's probably a similar schedule expected across Europe in terms of getting those seats filled. So what happens then once the 720 seats are filled? When does the Parliament sit, and what's the first thing they do?
So the elections start on the Thursday, the 6th, and then Ireland has that, because all across Europe there are different dates. So I think the Netherlands and a few other countries start on the Thursday. Ireland is Friday the 7th, and then there's elections on the Saturday. And then we'll know a lot of the elections on Sunday night. We'll be doing a live show from the European Parliament from 6 to midnight. And then once the results become clear, for example, what will start is the horse trading for the big jobs. So if the EPP, which is expected to do quite well, may gain a few seats, then they will see who they can coalesce with in order for them to get Ursula von der Leyen across the line to become president of the Commission. She needs 361 seats. So she could get 170 odd from the EPP, and then she'll have to build from other groups. And at the moment, she works with the S&D, which is the Social Democrats, which is kind of Labour Party, and Renew, which is the Liberal group, which is Fianna Fáil. But the Renew group is trailing in countries like France, for example, where they would have a lot of seats. They're 15 points behind the far right of Marine Le Pen. So it looks like they won't do so well. So will she then have to coalesce with the ECR, the far right, and the ID groups? Perhaps, because the S&D, the Social Democrats, won't work with them. So it's going to be really, really intense to see what happens there. And then it's also the council has to make that decision. It's the member states. It's not just the European Parliament. So each country has a unanimous, veto essentially to say whether they want Ursula von der Leyen back in, or do they pluck another candidate to kind of satisfy everyone there. So that's what'll happen. I mean, that could take a few weeks, and then once the votes are counted, they're back in session in September.
Okay, so no holidays for you this summer, Shona. Great, we'll leave it there. Shona Murray of Euronews and the Journal, Dina Finn and Mira Carville. I have one final reader contribution, which Nikki has just stuck on my screen here. Not a question, but this is from Mary Bigley, and she says she would like to thank you all for this excellent event and the splendid work you all do. The intelligence and rigor of all four speakers is tremendous. So there you go. Thank you, Mary Bigley. I assume, Nikki, that is a real comment and that you didn't just put that in to make us all feel better. So on that note, we'll wrap up and I'll speak to you all soon. Thank you.